Hey guys, welcome back to our End Time Updates. My name is Joshua Adams, and as always, I like to remind our viewers of why you're here in the first place, talking about End Time Updates. And the purpose of our time together is to make relevant the study of End Time prophecy with a focus of preparing the church for the return of Jesus Christ. So today we're answering the question once again, is the return of Jesus really going to happen? In our last few episodes, we talked about the nature and timing of his millennial reign. And to refresh your memory for those who are asking, what is the millennial reign of Christ? We're looking at a portion of scripture in Revelation chapter 20, an event that follows the return of Jesus Christ. And we see that after he returns, he binds Satan for 1,000 years and then reigns upon a messianic throne. Important term there, an important point to make for those 1,000 years. And after this, the eternal state is ushered in. And as I mentioned last week, there are three main views of the nature and timing of the millennium. And those three positions are amillennial, premillennial, and postmillennial. In our last episode, we defined a premillennial perspective. And in today's episode, I want to discuss the final view of the millennium called a postmillennial perspective. Now, although this perspective of postmillennialism has lost most of its credibility due to the fact that things are not improving but digressing tremendously, as we can just look in the world, just open the news or open up Instagram, Facebook, you'll see the world is digressing. We're still going to cover it so that you kind of have a complete perspective of all three main interpretations concerning the nature and the timing of the millennium. The term post-millennialism conveys this idea that Jesus will return after the millennium, but it's important to understand how post-millennialists define this 1,000 years. That is specifically and literally mentioned 6 different times in the book of Revelation. Revelation 20, 1 through 6 mentions it 6 different times. So it's important to understand that the post-millennialists do not interpret the millennial reign of Christ as being 1,000 years, but more so a long period of time from the first coming of Christ until his second coming. They define this period of time as sort of like a golden age in which after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the earth would experience a drastic improvement throughout time. They believe that Satan is currently bound, very similar to amillennialism, and that through the advancement of Christianity in the world today, then and today, that the world would be so impacted and literally the 4 corners of the world would be touched through the Great Commission, and that through this the world would become more and more Christianized, and that the gospel would go in throughout the world, impacting every aspect of society and influencing every form of government. Got to get my mouth working today, which would then, in essence, usher in this golden age and eradicate evil itself. And at this point, evil would no longer be present in the world around us. And then after this, the church would, after the church is influenced and dominated every sphere of government and society, ridding the world of evil, then and only then would Jesus return to judge the living and the dead, thus ushering in the eternal state. Now, there's a lot of holes within this type of perspective, first beginning with the very first thing that I mentioned, that the only time that Jesus was pessimistic about something in the Bible concerning you and I was when he was talking about end-time events, eschatology, end-time prophecy. He made it very clear that before his return, the world would not improve. The world would digress. It would get a whole lot worse, just like we're witnessing today. But before we talk about the problems within post-millennialism, I think it's important to talk about the history of post-millennialism. Where did it come from? Something important to note is that there is no trace of post-millennialism belief during the first 300 years of the church, from Pentecost, the birth of the church, until 300 years later. And as I mentioned before, the reason for that is because for the first 3 centuries of the church, premillennialism was the predominant view of eschatology. While amillennialism later, showed up and it became the predominant view within the era of Augustine, we see that amillennialism became more popular with Augustine. However, in the centuries to follow, some theologians begin to find many problems in Augustine's amillennial view and begin to suggest changes in allegorizing Scripture. And so some turn back to premillennialism, while others continue to follow this post-millennial doctrine that was really popularized by Daniel Whitby. He is a man in the 1600s. Daniel Whitby is an important individual to understand because he was a Unitarian minister in England who later was actually classified as a heretic, but his post-millennial eschatology remained and then quickly became popular as the world was advancing in its technologies. Now, this system of eschatology began to really fade as the 20th century arrived, because we had the First World War, then we had the Second World War, and so post-millennialism really began to fall apart. However, in recent years, and this is important to understand, that it's really come back to life with the surge of a new form of theology called theonomy, also known as Reconstructionism or dominion theology. It's important to understand that theonomy, if I can get that out of my mouth, or Reconstructionism is basically sees no distinction between the church and Israel, and therefore believes that the whole messianic structure is operative for today. So let's talk about quickly the problems of postmillennialism beyond what I've already mentioned with you already. First, they understand that the binding of Satan in Revelation 20:1-3 has already taken place at the first coming of Christ. Second, they ignore the nature and the constant use of the phrase 6 different times in Revelation 21-6. They see it as a figurative 1,000 years rather than a literal 1,000 years. Third, they fail to see the clear distinction of Israel and the church as two separate entities. And quickly, just to dismantle this idea of Reconstructionism, it's important to understand that the law of Moses was given to the nation of Israel, not to the church. The Old Testament promises made to Israel are for Israel, not for the church. And then fourth and finally, Jesus made it clear to John that at the close of this present age, the close of the age of the church, that it would be marked with apostasy, not a triumphal success of the gospel or a golden age of success by mankind. Jesus made it super clear in Revelation. Listen, apostasy is going to be present. He also mentioned in the Olivet Discourse that we see in Matthew 24:1-14 and Mark 13:1-13 that things would digress. Okay, the fact is the world is not progressing in its morality, but it is digressing and it is disintegrating rapidly. Okay, John 16:33, Jesus once, this is a very important scripture, he didn't say, listen, as I get closer to coming back that you'll have less and less trials and tribulations. He said, listen, you are going to experience many trials and tribulations. So it's going to get worse. It's going to basically digress. And just kind of for a bonus point, I think it's important to note, if the return of Jesus depended on the church impacting the world, Jesus would never come back. Why? Because the majority of Christians today are sitting on their salvation, doing nothing instead of using it to impact the world. So I hope that helps bring a little clarity on the 3 different perspectives in view of the millennial reign of Christ. In our next episode, we are going to discuss the nature and timing of the rapture, talking about the 3 views of when will we be leaving. Until next time, keep your hand on the plow, your eyes in the sky. I love you guys. We'll see you next week.